You're sitting in a booth at a Perkins diner in a town called Oilwine, Iowa. It's 6:15 p.m. on a Tuesday. The air in the diner smells like maple syrup and industrial-grade floor cleaner. You're wearing a Carhartt jacket with a frayed collar and a pair of Red Wing boots that have a permanent gray tint from decades of walking on crushed limestone and iron filings. To the waitress, Sarah, who has served you the same patty melt for 8 years, you are just another guy who probably works in a machine shop or drives a gravel truck. You're quiet. You tip exactly 22%. You leave without a word. Sarah doesn't know that 20 minutes ago, while sitting in your dusty 2014 Ford F-150 in the parking lot, you tapped a glass screen and finalized a wire transfer for $18.4 million. It was the final payout from a private equity firm out of Chicago. The total enterprise value of the deal? $112 million. You own 94% of the shares. You don't feel like a titan of industry. You feel the same low-grade ache in your lower back that you've had since the Clinton administration. You take a sip of the burnt coffee and look out the window at the rain. This is what a monopoly looks like. It isn't chrome and glass. It's rust, grease, in the silence of a man who knows exactly what everything is worth. It didn't start with a vision. It started with $4,200 in a desperate need to not work for someone else. In 1996, $4,200 was a fortune and a pittance all at once. It was your entire life savings, scraped together from 3 years of working the night shift at a local foundry. You bought a 1984 Chevy C30 flatbed with a transmission that slipped in second gear and a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters. You didn't have a business plan. You had a realization. The world is full of heavy, ugly things that people are willing to pay you to take away, and other people are willing to pay you to buy. You spent your first 2 years in the mud. You'd wake up at 4:30 a.m., the air in your small apartment smelling like damp wool. You'd drive that Chevy to construction sites, back alley machine shops, and shuttered textile mills. You weren't looking for gold. You were looking for #1 heavy melt. You were looking for bright and shiny copper. You would spend 10 hours in the rain, winching rusted I-beams onto the back of your truck, your hands vibrating from the cold and the weight. The steel. You take it to the regional yard, a place owned by a man named Henderson, and he'd give you a check for $600 for a load that took you 3 days to collect. After gas, dumping fees, and the $40 you slipped the site foreman to let you in, you were making less than minimum wage. But you weren't just hauling metal. You were studying the gate. You noticed that Henderson's yard was inefficient. His cranes were old. His staff was lazy. He'd let copper sit in unmonitored bins where it would get rained on and oxidized, lowering the grade. You realized that the scrap business wasn't about the metal. It was about the margin of the sort. If you could sort the metal better than the guy buying it from you, you were leaving money on the table. The turning point came in 2002. You didn't buy a new truck. You bought a plot of land. It was 2 acres of contaminated dirt behind a rendering plant that smelled like death. It cost you $35,000, funded by a high-interest SBA loan that kept you awake at night, staring at the ceiling and calculating how many tons of aluminum siding you needed to move to cover the $480 monthly payment. You stopped selling to Henderson. You became the yard. You realized that the local plumbers and electricians were like you 5 years ago. They had trucks full of scrap, but no place to put it. You offered them a deal. Bring it to you, and you'd pay them 5% more than Henderson, in cash, no questions asked. You stayed open until 8 p.m. when the other yards closed at 5. You worked the scale yourself. You'd stand there in the wind, weighing trucks, writing out handwritten tickets, and handing over greasy 20s. You weren't a businessman. You were a ghost in the supply chain. You lived in a trailer on the back of a lot for 3 years. You showered with a garden hose and ate canned tuna. You didn't care. Every ton of steel you bought for $140, you sold to the mills for $210. The math was relentless. Then came the scale. By 2008, the world was collapsing. The price of steel plummeted. Most scrapyards, built on cheap credit and bloated overhead, began to bleed out. Henderson, the man you used to sell to, was the first to break. He had 3 yards and a fleet of shiny Mack trucks he couldn't afford. You walked into his office in a stained t-shirt. You didn't talk about synergies or EBITDA. You talked about the debt he owed the bank. You bought his entire operation for the cost of the underlying real estate and the assumption of his equipment leases. You didn't stop there. You realized the scrap industry was fragmented. thousands of small, family-owned yards run by guys who wanted to retire but had no sons to take over. You started the roll-up. It's a fancy finance term for what you did. You became a vacuum. You'd find a yard in a town 3 counties over, you'd look at their books, which were usually just shoeboxes full of receipts, and you'd offer them a quiet exit. You weren't a corporate raider. You were a guy who spoke their language, who knew the difference between 304 and 316 stainless steel just by the way it sparked against a grinder. By 2015, you owned 12 yards across 3 states. You had a monopoly, but not the kind they write about in the Wall Street Journal. It was a boring monopoly. If someone wanted to dispose of an old bridge or a fleet of decommissioned school buses in the tri-state area, they had to talk to you. You controlled the scale. You controlled the logistics. You bought a fleet of your own rail cars to bypass the trucking premiums. You were moving 600,000 tons of metal a year. Your EBITDA margins were a consistent 11%. On $400 million in revenue, that's $44 million in pure, unadulterated profit. But you didn't change. You still drove the Ford. You still lived in a house that cost $220,000. You kept your name off the buildings. You operated under names like Midwest Recovery Services or Central Plains Materials. When the city council complained about the noise, you didn't send a lawyer in a suit. You went yourself, wearing your work boots, and talked about the jobs you were providing for the local boys. You were the biggest employer in 4 different counties, and yet nobody knew your net worth. You liked it that way. The moment people know you have money, they start trying to find ways to take it. But nobody wants to take a scrapyard. It's dirty, it's loud, it's dangerous. It's the perfect hiding place for a fortune. The operations were the hardest part. People think scrap is just sitting on a pile of junk, but it's a high-speed logistics game. You had to manage the volatility of the LME, the London Metal Exchange. You had to deal with the EPA and their soil samples. You had to deal with the unions at the steel mills who would reject a 100-ton load of scrap because they found a single closed cylinder that might explode in the furnace. You spent your nights staring at spreadsheets, tracking the price of iron ore in China and the demand for copper in India. You were a global commodities trader disguised as a guy who owned a junkyard. The stress was a silent weight. You remember a Tuesday in 2019 when a hydraulic line snapped on a $5 million shredder. Every hour that machine was down cost you $12,000 in lost throughput. You were out there in the grease, 60 years old, holding a flashlight for a 24-year-old mechanic, screaming over the wind. Your hands were covered in black oil that would take a week to wash off. That's the reality they don't tell you about passive income. Nothing is passive. Everything is decaying. Everything is trying to break. Your job was simply to be the man who refused to let it fall apart. And then the offer came. It wasn't a phone call. It was a letter from a law firm representing a multi-billion-dollar industrial conglomerate. They wanted a footprint in the Midwest. They wanted your permits. Most importantly, they wanted your nodes, the strategically placed yards that gave you a stranglehold on the regional supply. They offered a 9 times multiple on your trailing 12-month earnings. You sat in your office, a wood-paneled room in a corrugated metal building, and looked at the offer. $112 million. You thought about that $4,200 Chevy truck. You thought about the smell of the rendering plant. You thought about Dale, your first employee, who died of a heart attack 6 years ago and whose funeral you paid for. You realized that the game was over. You had won the monopoly. There was nothing left to buy that wouldn't attract the kind of attention you spent 30 years avoiding. So you signed. You didn't have a party. You didn't buy a watch. You went to the Perkins in Olwine. You finish your patty melt. You place a $5 bill on the table next to the check. You walk out into the cool Iowa evening, the smell of rain hitting the pavement. Your phone buzzes in your pocket. It's an alert from your wealth management app, showing a balance that looks like a phone number. You ignore it. You climb into your truck and turn the key. The engine rumbles, a familiar mechanical sound. You look at your hands. There's a permanent scar on your left thumb from a piece of jagged rebar in 1999. There's grease under your fingernails that no soap will ever reach. You put the truck in gear and drive past your old yard. The gates are locked. The new owners have put up a sign with a corporate logo in blue and white. It looks clean. It looks professional. It looks like it belongs to someone else. You drive toward the highway, heading nowhere in particular. You're 62 years old. You're a ghost. You're a 100 millionaire
in a Carhartt jacket. And the best part, the absolutely best part, is that as you drive through the town you built, brick by rusted brick, not a single person looks twice. You are invisible. And in the world of high finance, that is the ultimate luxury. You didn't just build an empire. You built a fortress of silence. And now,
For the first time in 30 years, you don't have to worry about the price of steel. You just have to worry about where to get breakfast tomorrow. And you already know the answer. It'll be the same place it's always been. The boring stuff never changes. That's why it's the only thing worth owning.